The skies over North Vietnam in late 1966 were a slaughterhouse for American pilots, and the Pentagon was running out of solutions. The United States Air Force, possessing the most advanced technology in the world, was being humiliated by a tiny Third World Air Force flying Soviet export fighters. The problem was specific and mechanical. The Republic F-105 Thunderchief, the Thud, as the pilots called it, was a workhorse designed for a different war. It was a supersonic truck built to carry a nuclear weapon low and fast over Europe. But in Vietnam, it was being used to haul racks of conventional iron bombs over the dense jungles of the Red River Delta. Loaded down with ordnance, the Thuds were heavy, sluggish, and vulnerable. They had to fly predictable routes at predictable times to hit their targets. And the North Vietnamese Air Force had figured out the schedule. Every day, the American bombers would lumber north, and every day, the North Vietnamese MiG-21s would rise to meet them. The MiG-21 fishbed was the antithesis of the Thud. It was a silver dart, small, agile, and incredibly fast. The Soviet doctrine was simple. Ground controllers would guide the MiGs into position behind the heavy American formations. The MiGs would dive from high altitude, fire heat-seeking atoll missiles, and then use their superior speed to zoom back up into the safety of the sanctuary across the Chinese border where the Americans were forbidden to follow. It was a hit-and-run tactic that was bleeding the U.S. Air Force dry. The American escort fighters, the F-4 Phantoms, were powerless to stop it. By the time the Phantoms jettisoned their fuel tanks to engage, the MiGs were gone. The mood at the American bases in Thailand was toxic. Pilots were refusing to fly. They felt they were being sent on suicide missions by commanders in Washington who didn't understand the geometry of air combat. Into this atmosphere of defeat walked Colonel Robin Olds. Olds was not a typical officer. He was a relic of a bygone era, a World War II double ace who had shot down Germans over Europe and was now, at age 44, itching for a fight in Southeast Asia. He wore a non-regulation handlebar mustache that violated every dress code in the manual, a symbol of his defiance against the bureaucracy. When he took command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in September 1966, he didn't give a speech about patriotism. He gathered his pilots and told them that he was going to learn to fly the F-4 Phantom better than any of them. And until he did, he would listen. But once he did, he would lead from the front. Olds realized immediately that the problem wasn't the pilots. It was the predictability. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition using a rigid script. The Soviets and their Vietnamese proxies had memorized the script. To win, Olds knew he had to throw the script away. The solution came during a session of frustration and whiskey in the officers' club. Olds and his tactical officers, including his vice commander Chappie James, were analyzing the MiG tactics. The enemy refused to engage the F-4 Phantoms directly. The North Vietnamese ground controllers could tell the difference between a BFLI formation of F-105 bombers and a formation of F-4 fighters on their radar screens. They only launched the MiGs when they saw the bombers. They stayed on the ground when the fighters swept through. It was a discipline that infuriated the Americans. Olds realized that he couldn't force the MiGs to fight. He had to trick them. He had to present them with a target that looked like a slow, fat, juicy bomber, but was actually a shark in sheep's clothing. The key to the deception lay in the electronic signature. The North Vietnamese radar operators identified the American formations not just by speed and altitude, but by their jamming equipment. The F-105 bombers carried a specific electronic countermeasures pod called the QRC-160. This pod jammed the enemy's fire control radars, but it also acted as a beacon. When the Soviet-trained radar operators saw the specific interference pattern of the QRC-160, they knew it was a Thud strike package. The F-4 Phantoms, the fighters, did not carry these pods. Their absence on the radar screen told the enemy, "Caution, fighters." Olds conceived a plan so audacious it bordered on insanity. He ordered the maintenance crews to strip the QRC-160 pods off the F-105 bombers and mount them onto the F-4 Phantoms. This required emergency field engineering, rewiring the pylons of the fighters to accept the bomber equipment. But the disguise went deeper than just electronics. Olds briefed his pilots on a new flight profile. They would not fly like fighters. They would fly like bombers. The plan, codenamed Operation Bolo, required the F-4 Phantoms to mimic the F-105s in every conceivable way. They would fly at the exact same altitude, the exact same speed, and in the exact same fluid-4 formation used by the bombers. They would use the F-105 radio call signs and voice procedures. They would take off at the same time the bombers usually launched. To the radar operators sitting in the bunkers near Hanoi, the blips on the screen would look, smell, and sound exactly like the daily milk run of heavy, vulnerable thuds. They would see the jamming pods, the speed, the formation, and they would scramble the MiGs for an easy kill. Olds was betting the lives of his men on the assumption that the enemy would take the bait. The trap was set for January 2nd, 1967. The objective was not to bomb a bridge or a depot. The objective was to sweep the sky. Olds planned to lead the first wave himself. He would fly his F-4 straight over the main north Vietnamese airfields at Phuoc Yen and Gia Long. He would dangle himself as the lure. When the MiGs popped up through the cloud deck to ambush the bombers, they would find themselves merging not with laden trucks, but with the deadliest air-to-air platform in the American arsenal, stripped for combat and carrying a full load of Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles. The preparation was intense. The ground crews worked through the night to modify the Phantoms. The pilots were briefed on the missile trap. The timing had to be perfect. If the Phantoms arrived too early, the MiGs wouldn't launch. If they arrived too late, the deception would be revealed. The different flights of F-4 South were given the call signs of American cars. Olds would lead Olds flight, followed by Ford, Rambler, and Vespa. It was a nod to the industrial might of Detroit coming to crush the Soviet export market. As the sun rose on January 2nd, the weather was terrible. Thick cloud cover blanketed the target area. In a normal bombing mission, this would be a no-go. You can't bomb what you can't see. But Olds wasn't bombing ground targets. He was hunting aircraft, and the MiGs needed to come up through the clouds to attack. The overcast sky actually worked in his favor, creating a ceiling that would force the engagement into a tight arena. Olds climbed into his cockpit, checked the QRC-160 pod on his wing, and signaled the start. The wolf pack was going hunting. The engines roared to life, and one by one, the disguised Phantoms lifted off the Thai runway, forming up into the sluggish, heavy formation of the bombers they were pretending to be. They turned north, heading straight for the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, waiting for the Soviet radar to ping them and for the trap to snap shut. The deception began in the invisible spectrum. As Robin Olds led his flight of F-4 Phantoms across the Laotian border and into North Vietnam, the electronic warfare officers in the back seats were flipping the switches on the QRC-160 jamming pods. To the Soviet-trained radar operators sitting in dark bunkers near Hanoi, the screens lit up with the familiar ragged static that indicated a heavy raid of F-105 Thunderchiefs. The deception was working perfectly. The ground control intercept controllers saw exactly what they expected to see: a slow, laden formation of American bombers flying a predictable route at 17,000 feet, heading straight for the capital. They picked up their microphones and issued the order that Olds had been praying for. They scrambled the MiGs. At Phuoc Yen Air Base, the premier fighter field of the North, the MiG-21s were alerted. The pilots, the elite of the Vietnamese Air Force, rushed the silver jets. They were confident. They believed they were launching to slaughter sheep. They ignited their afterburners and roared down the runway, piercing the low, heavy cloud deck that blanketed the valley. Their plan was standard doctrine: punch through the clouds, locate the slow Americans from behind, fire heat-seeking missiles, and dive back into the overcast before the enemy escorts could react. They had no idea that the escorts were already there, waiting in the blind spot, stripped of bombs and armed with air-to-air missiles. Robin Olds arrived over the target area 3 minutes early. The timing discrepancy, caused by tailwinds, was a moment of supreme tension. The sky was empty. The thick carpet of clouds below him hid the ground completely. For a terrifying minute, Olds worried the enemy had sensed the trap. He led his flight in a wide, lazy turn, maintaining the bomber-like profile, banking the Phantom slowly to keep the deception alive on the radar scopes. And then the trap snapped shut. The first MiG-21 burst through the cloud layer directly in front of Olds' flight. It was a silver flash against the gray mist. Then another appeared, and another. They popped up like sharks breaching the surface of the water, looking for the belly of a whale. But instead of finding heavy Thunderchiefs loaded with 750-pound bombs, the MiG pilots found themselves face-to-face with F-4 Phantoms flying in combat spread, engines idling, ready to fight. The shock in the North Vietnamese cockpits must have been total. In a split second, the hunters became the hunted. The geometry of the engagement was instantly reversed. The MiGs were low, slow, and climbing a low-energy state, while the Americans were high, fast, and heavy with kinetic energy. The battle that followed was a chaotic, swirling melee that lasted only 12 minutes, but it changed the history of air combat. It was a three-dimensional knife fight at 500 miles per hour. The sky filled with the smoke trails of missiles and the glint of afterburners. Olds threw his heavy Phantom into a violent turn. The F-4 was not designed to dogfight. It was a muscle car, big and powerful, while the MiG-21 was a sports car, nimble and tight. But Olds knew how to use the Phantom's vertical power. One of the MiGs, realizing the trap, banked hard to the left to escape. Olds reacted with a maneuver that has become legendary in aviation history. He didn't try to turn inside the smaller jet. Instead, he pulled his Phantom up into the vertical, using the sheer thrust of his massive J-79 engines to climb away from the Earth, then rolled the aircraft over on its back a vector roll and pulled the nose down behind the MiG. It was a masterful use of three-dimensional space. As he came down the backside of the loop, he found himself perfectly positioned in the MiG's 6 o'clock. Olds squeezed the trigger for 2 Sidewinder missiles. But this was 1967, and the technology was unreliable. The first missile failed to guide. The second one tracked. It streaked across the short distance and slammed into the right wing of the MiG-21. The explosion tore the wing off. The silver jet snap-rolled violently and disintegrated, the pilot ejecting into the cloud deck below. It was Olds' first kill of the war, and the first verification that Operation Bolo was a success. All around him, his wolf pack was feasting. The radio channels, usually disciplined, were a cacophony of warnings and kill calls. Olds 01, break left. MiG at 6 o'clock. Splash 1, I got him. The American pilots, released from the restrictive rules of engagement that usually hamstrung them, were fighting with a ferocity born of months of frustration. They were avenging every Thud driver who had been shot down in the previous year. The North Vietnamese formation broke apart completely. The coordinated ambush they had planned dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival. The MiGs tried to dive back into the clouds, but the Phantoms were waiting for them, firing Sparrow radar-guided missiles that could track through the mist. By the time the fuel gauges on the American jets began to hit bingo, the level required to return to base, the sky was clear of enemy aircraft. The surviving MiGs had fled north to the sanctuary of the Chinese border. Olds called for the regroup. Wolf pack, reform, and egress. The Phantoms formed up, lighter now, missing their missiles, but carrying a different kind of weight. Victory. As they turned south toward Thailand, they did a roll call. Olds listened with dread, waiting for the silence that would indicate a lost plane. Ford flight, check in. Rambler flight, check in. Every single American pilot answered. Not a single F-4 had been scratched. When the Wolf Pack arrived back at Ubon, they didn't just land. They announced their triumph to the world. Olds led a low-level, high-speed pass over the airfield. And then, one by one, the Phantoms performed a victory roll, a spiraling maneuver down the runway that signified a kill. The ground crews, who had spent the night before wiring the jamming pods and praying for their pilots, stopped working and cheered. As the jets taxied to the revetments, the magnitude of the score became clear. In a single 12-minute engagement, Robin Olds' men had shot down 7 MiG-21s. To put that number in perspective, the North Vietnamese Air Force only had 16 operational MiG-21s in their entire inventory. In one morning, Operation Bolo had destroyed nearly half of the enemy's advanced fighter force. It was an annihilation. The Thud disguise had worked so well that the Soviet advisors on the ground in North Vietnam were reportedly stunned into silence. They grounded the entire MiG-21 fleet for months to figure out what had happened. The Americans had regained air superiority, not by building a better plane, but by building a better lie. But the victory at Ubon was about more than just numbers. It was a vindication of a philosophy. Robin Olds had proved that technology, the missiles, the radars, the jamming pods, was useless without the human element of guile. He had taken the rigid, technocratic approach of the Pentagon and injected it with the raw, progressive spirit of a World War II ace. The photo taken of him after the mission shows a man exhausted, sweating, covered in oil and soot, with that magnificent, non-regulation mustache bristling over a grin. He looked like a pirate who had just boarded a galleon. Operation Bolo effectively shut down the MiG threat for the spring of 1967. The B-52s and F-105s could strike their targets with relative impunity, but the war was far from over. The Soviets were not going to take the humiliation lying down. They studied the American tactics. They analyzed the radar tapes of the battle. And they began to adapt. The game of cat and mouse over the rice paddies of Vietnam was about to evolve again, and the next surprise would not come from the air, but from the ground, in the form of a missile envelope that was expanding every day. Robin Olds had won the battle of the disguise, but the war of attrition was a monster that even 7 kills couldn't slay. The legacy of that day, however, rippled through the decades. It taught the U.S. Air Force a lesson that would eventually lead to the creation of the Top Gun and Red Flag schools, that you cannot engineer your way out of a dogfight. You have to fly your way out. And sometimes the best way to kill a shark is to put on a sheepskin and wait for him to bite. As Olds climbed down from his cockpit, greeted by a mob of cheering mechanics, he was already thinking about the next problem. The MiGs were gone for now, but the surface-to-air missiles, the deadly SAMs, were still there, waiting in the jungle like vipers, and they didn't care what kind of jamming pod you were wearing. The ambush was over, but the gauntlet remained. The annihilation of the MiG-21 force on January 2, 1967, bought the United States Air Force a temporary reprieve, but it also triggered a frantic evolution in the air war that would turn the skies over Vietnam into the most dangerous electromagnetic environment in history. The Soviet advisors on the ground at Phuoc Yen were not just embarrassed, they were professionally alarmed. The Americans had used the Soviet Union's own reliance on radar discipline against them. By mimicking the electronic signature of the bombers, Robin Olds had hacked the Soviet decision-making loop. The response from Moscow and Hanoi was swift and pragmatic. They grounded the entire MiG-21 fleet. For months, The silver darts stayed in their concrete revetments, their pilots undergoing grueling debriefings to understand how they had been led into a slaughterhouse. But the grounding of the fighters didn't mean the sky was safe. It simply meant the North Vietnamese shifted the burden of defense from the air to the ground, unleashing a weapon that didn't care about disguises or jamming pods. The S-75 DVINA, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline. The SA-2 was a terrifying piece of technology, a missile the size of a telephone pole that accelerated to Mach 3.5. Unlike the heat-seeking missiles carried by the MiGs, which chased tailpipes, the SA-2 was guided by a ground-based radar called fan song. The radar beam would paint the American aircraft, and the missile would ride the beam to the target, detonating a warhead filled with 400 pounds of shrapnel. With the MiGs out of action, the North Vietnamese missile crews became aggressive. They moved their batteries into the jungle, camouflaging them with bamboo and netting, setting up shoot-and-scoot ambushes that made every mission a game of Russian roulette. Operation Bolo had cleared the fighters, but it had kicked the hornet's nest of the surface-to-air missile network. This shift forced the Americans to invent an entirely new form of warfare, one that required a level of bravery bordering on the suicidal. They called it the Wild Weasel Mission. While Robin Olds and his wolf pack hunted MiGs, the weasels hunted radars. Flying F-105s modified with sensitive receivers, these pilots would intentionally fly into the kill zone of the SA-2 batteries. Their job was to act as live bait. They would wait for the fan song radar to lock onto them, a sound that screamed in their headsets like a rattlesnake, and then trace the beam back to its source on the ground. Once they located the radar van, they would dive straight at the missile site, firing anti-radiation missiles designed to destroy the antenna. The motto of the Weasels was YGBSM. You gotta be shitting me, a phrase uttered by one of the first electronic warfare officers when he was told what his job description would be. Robin Olds found himself fighting a war on two fronts. In the air, he was dodging telephone poles filled with high explosives. On the ground, he was fighting the Pentagon. The success of Operation Bolo had made him a celebrity, a status he despised because it brought scrutiny. Generals in Washington, obsessed with statistics and public relations, wanted to manage their new hero. They worried he was taking too many risks. They scrutinized his flight logs, and they fixated on the one thing Olds refused to surrender, his mustache. The waxed, handlebar mustache had become a totem for the pilots of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing. It was a fuck you to the sterile, micromanaged corporate culture of the Air Force. It violated every regulation in the book, but as long as Olds was killing MiGs, the brass couldn't touch him. It became the symbol of the Olds way, results over rules, combat effectiveness over polish. But the deception of Operation Bolo had a shelf life. It was a magic trick, and like all magic tricks, it only works until the audience knows the secret. The North Vietnamese radar operators quickly learned to distinguish between real F-105 formations and F-4 imposters. They looked for subtle differences in flight paths, in radio chatter, and in the pulse repetition frequency of the jamming pods. The game of cat and mouse accelerated. The U's introduced new jamming pods. The Soviets introduced new radar frequencies. The U's introduced standoff jammers. The Soviets introduced optical tracking systems that didn't use radar at all. The sky over Hanoi became a laboratory where the theories of electronic warfare were tested in blood. By the summer of 1967, the MiGs returned, but their tactics had changed. They stopped trying to dogfight the Phantoms. Instead, they used slash and dash attacks controlled by ground radar, engaging only when the geometry was perfect and fleeing before the Americans could turn. Olds continued to lead from the front, racking up 3 more kills, bringing his total to 4-1 short of the coveted ace status in Vietnam. The pressure to get that 5th kill became intense. His pilots wanted it for him. The press wanted it for the headlines. But Olds began to suspect that if he shot down a fifth MiG, the Air Force would instantly pull him out of combat and put him on a wall. Publicity tour selling war bonds in Ohio. He was a warrior, not a salesman. There are rumors, never confirmed, but widely believed by his men, that Robin Olds intentionally passed up kill shots in his final months to avoid becoming an ace, just so he could keep flying and leading his wolf pack. The psychological toll of the air war was immense. Olds was flying missions that were statistically almost unsurvivable. He was watching his friends die, shot down by missiles or shredded by anti-aircraft fire. He was writing letters to widows at night and briefing pilots at dawn. The euphoria of Operation Bolo had faded into the grinding attrition of rolling thunder, a bombing campaign that seemed to have no strategic end. A disconnect between the pilots risking their lives and the politicians. Selecting targets in Washington grew wider every day. Olds became the voice of that frustration, a commander who protected his men from the stupidity of their own headquarters as fiercely as he protected them from the MiGs. In September 1967, the inevitable happened. The Air Force decided that Colonel Olds was too valuable to lose. He was relieved of command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing and ordered to report to the Air Force Academy as the Commandant of Cadets. It was a desk job, a prestigious exile. On his final day at Ubon, the base turned out to say goodbye. The pilots, the mechanics, the armorer's men, who had walked through fire for him, lined the runway. Olds climbed into his Phantom for one last flight, a solo pass over the base that shook the feelings of everyone on the ground. When he landed, he was no longer the hunter. He was a legend, boxed up, and shipped home. Operation Bolo remained the high-water mark of tactical ingenuity in the war. It was a moment when the American Goliath stopped trying to smash the enemy with a hammer and decided to use a scalpel. But its legacy went beyond the 7 burning wrecks on the jungle floor. It proved that in the age of missiles and computers, the pilot still mattered. It proved that a commander who led from the cockpit could extract performance from his men that no distant general could order. And it proved that sometimes the most effective weapon in a war is a good lie told at the speed of sound. As Robin Olds flew home, the war continued to churn. The technological arms race he had helped ignite would birth the modern era of air combat. The lessons learned from the QRC-160 pods and the Wild Weasels would lead directly to the stealth technology of the F-117 and the F-22. The electronic order of battle became as important as the physical one. But for the men of the wolf pack, the memory was simpler. It wasn't about the electronics. It was about the day the old man put on a mask, walked into the enemy's house, and punched him in the mouth. It was the day they stopped being targets and started being predators. When Robin Olds returned to the United States in late 1967, he was greeted not as a conquering hero, but as a problem to be managed. He was too loud, too charismatic, and too honest for the political establishment that was mismanaging the war. His first meeting with the Air Force Chief of Staff, General John P. McConnell, has become a piece of military folklore. Olds walked into the general's office in the Pentagon, wearing his flight suit and sporting the massive wax-tipped handlebar mustache that had become world famous. McConnell looked at him, pointed a finger at the mustache, and said 3 words, "Take it off." Olds didn't argue. He didn't salute. He just said, "Yes, sir." He walked to a mirror, shaved it off, and dropped the hair in the trash. The mustache had served its purpose. It was a war paint for the jungle. It didn't belong in the corridors of Washington. With the fall of the mustache, the era of the wolf pack officially ended, and the era of the bureaucrat resumed. Olds was assigned to the U.S. Air Force Academy as the Commandant of Cadets. It was supposed to be a quiet twilight for his career, a place where he could fade away while training the next generation of officers. But Olds didn't do quiet. He looked at the cadets and saw robotic, rule-following automatons who were being trained to die. He turned the academy upside down. He threw out the rigid discipline manuals that focused on shining shoes and replaced them with lectures on aerial maneuver and survival. He told the cadets, "I don't care if you can march. I care if you can think." He was trying to clone himself, to create a generation of officers who would question orders that didn't make sense, just as he had questioned the tactics in Vietnam. But while Olds was trying to save the soul of the Air Force, the war he left behind ground on to its tragic conclusion. The North Vietnamese eventually adapted to every trick the Americans invented. The skies over Hanoi remained the deadliest on Earth until the end of the conflict. However, the lesson of Operation Bolo was not lost. In the grim aftermath of Vietnam, the U.S. military realized that technology alone had failed them. They had the fastest jets and the best missiles, yet they had lost. They realized that Robin Olds was right. The pilot mattered more than the plane. This realization birthed a revolution in military training that defines American air power today. In 1969, the Navy formed the Top Gun School, and in 1975, the Air Force created Red Flag. These programs were built on the philosophy of Operation Bolo, realism and deception. At Red Flag, pilots didn't fly against imaginary targets. They flew against aggressor squadrons. American pilots flying American jets painted to look like Soviet MiGs, using Soviet tactics. They learned to fight the way Olds fought, messy, chaotic, and unscripted. The ambush of January 2nd became a case study in every war college in the Western world. It taught that electronic warfare, the use of the electromagnetic spectrum to confuse and blind the enemy, was not just a support function. It was the primary weapon. The Soviet Union learned from the ambush as well. The humiliation of losing half their air force in 12 minutes forced a complete redesign of their doctrine. They realized that their rigid, ground-controlled interception method was flawed. You couldn't fly a fighter jet by remote control from a bunker. They began to give their pilots more autonomy, creating a more dangerous adversary for the future. The game of cat and mouse that Olds played with his jamming pods evolved into the modern stealth wars. Today, the deception isn't about disguising a fighter as a bomber. It's about disguising a fighter as nothing, making it invisible to radar entirely. Robin Olds retired from the Air Force in 1973 as a brigadier general. He spent his retirement in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, skiing and drinking with old friends, refusing to write a memoir for decades because he didn't want to profit from the war. He remained a critic of the technocrats until his death in 2007. When he died, the Air Force held a memorial service that was attended by thousands. During the flyover, a flight of F-4 Phantoms planes that had long been retired from active service roared over the cemetery. One of them pulled up into the vertical and disappeared into the clouds, the missing man formation performed by the very aircraft he had made legendary. The F-4 Phantom itself is a central character in this legacy. It was an ugly, brutal machine. The pilots called it the flying brick and joked that with enough thrust, you can make a brick fly. It smoked, it was heavy, and it had no internal gun. It was the embodiment of American brute force. But in the hands of Robin Olds, it became a scalpel. He proved that you don't need the most agile plane to win. You need the most agile mind. Operation Bolo was the Phantom's finest hour. A moment where the brick outdanced the dart, because the man in the cockpit knew exactly what the enemy was thinking. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see Robin Olds' F-4C Phantom. It sits silent now, its J-79 engines cold. On the intake splitter, you can still see the red stars painted there, marking the kills from Vietnam. But the real monument to the mission isn't the medal. It's the mindset. Every time an F-22 Raptor pilot turns off his radar to sneak up on an enemy, every time an electronic warfare officer jams a signal to create a phantom target. They are using the playbook written on that cloudy morning in 1967. Operation Bolo stands as the last great visual deception of the air age. Before combat moved beyond visual range, before computers took over the merging of targets, there was a moment when a general put on a mask, flew into the lion's den, and dared the enemy to come out and play. It reminds us that war, for all its horrifying machinery, remains a fundamentally human contest of wits. The Soviets had better radar, faster missiles, and home field advantage. But they lost because they trusted their screens, and Robin Olds trusted his gut. In the history of aerial warfare, it remains the ultimate con, the day the wolf put on sheep's clothing and ate the flock.